Welcome to Kung Fu Podcast episode number 134. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about, and I'm your host, T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in an episode where we're in part 3 of looking at the biography of one of the most pivotal and sometimes polarizing personalities in Chinese martial arts. His name is Sun Lu Tang. If you missed the first 2 episodes, I would highly encourage you to go back to number 132. Start there. It starts off with a little backdrop from an essay from our good friend of the program, Dr. Ben Junkins, who you can find over at Kung Fu Tea by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ben. Then we had an essay from Ian Abernathy's forum, which discusses the ideas and the concepts of how martial arts of different areas were going through these transitions of medicalization, longevity, and health, things that were changing inside the martial arts in itself across other countries as well as in China. And I also discussed why I had this particular podcast tabled for such a long time. I had to work out a lot of different sides of it. I always try to approach things from both the prosecution and the defense, and that way I can at least look at it and judge it from both sides as fairly as possible. I have a good friend. His name is Paul Cody. He is a Bakwa practitioner, a fantastic guy, and also a really good researcher. He really believes in doing his due diligence in other areas besides the good practice of Chinese martial arts. Paul's going to be with me and Troy Price on September the 2nd when we're down there at Myrtle Beach doing the Internal Martial Arts Seminar. And all that builds up that Sun Lu Tang really made a difference in the direction that the Chinese martial was going. He wasn't the only catalyst in this process, but he was one of the biggest stirrers of the pot. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at where Sun Lu Tang was, where China, across the board, whether it was art, medicine, health, martial arts, it was at the crossroads of modernity. Everything was changing, and as I said before, martial arts was not going to be left behind. It was either going to have to modern up or go away. And it almost went away. If this is your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. I hope that you have a great time while you're here and you find some of the information that I share to be informative as well as educational, and hopefully I'm getting better at presenting it. Just as a note, if you enjoy this program, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/support and see a list of different things that I could use to keep this program going, to keep it served up, and to keep it in a timeline. Every little bit helps. I would also appreciate it if you haven't yet to go over to iTunes and leave us a review that is representative of the work I do, or if nothing else, tell someone else who that you practice with about this program. I would greatly appreciate it. Okay, so let's get ready. Let me get a little swallow of water. It's time to look at Sun Lu Tang at the crossroads of modernity. In parts 1 and 2, Kung Fu Podcast number 132 and 133, you were presented an outline of the life and the career of a key figure in the Chinese martial arts. Sun Lu Tang has made many contributions to the traditional martial arts community. He is responsible for innovations as diverse as the use of photography and training manuals, the popularization of the term Neijia, or internal, as a descriptive category, the pronounced emphasis on health and philosophy in the Chinese martial arts, and the creation of his own style of Tai Chi. His ideas have been incredibly important. For better or for worse, they have shaped the subsequent development of the Chinese martial arts in every region of China and in the West. We will look at this legacy in more detail as we go further in this episode. From the perspective of the Chinese martial arts studies, perhaps the greatest gift that Sun Lu Tang left was a rich and well-documented life that intersected with some of the most important social, political, and martial trends of the era. Even though Sun's detailed diary of his daily life was lost in the Cultural Revolution, we still have a surprising amount of information about his life, studies, travels, and thoughts on the state of the martial arts. He is associated with many of the leading lights of the period, and he also witnessed the critical events in the formation of the social systems that we now refer to as the traditional martial arts. Sun Lutang's life provides students of Chinese martial studies with a surprisingly clear window into the past. By carefully studying his associations and innovations, it is possible to gain a much greater understanding of how the Chinese martial arts of northern China were evolving and changing at the end of the 19th century. His biography, when placed in the proper context, reads like a textbook of Chinese martial arts history. You and I are going to review a couple of trends that first arose in the earlier brief summary of Sun's life and his career. Our goal is to ask how these events illustrate larger themes or questions in Chinese martial history. There are going to be no shocking revelations to emerge from this exercise, yet we are still going to see a much more nuanced view of the basic institutions of Chinese martial culture as they emerge, and then they can be studied within the career of a single martial artist. So now let's look at the heading, Closed Doors versus Secure Networks, the Economics and Social Functionality of Traditional Instruction. Ben writes in his essay, "We have all encountered the debates before. Who was that closed-door student? Of whom? Who can really claim to be the true inheritor of some style of kung fu? Of all the criticisms that one can make of the Chinese martial arts, a lack of interest in politics will never be one of them." Amen, Ben. At the end of the day, all sorts of debates in the modern Chinese martial arts seem to devolve into attempts to criticize the quality of someone else's instruction. The idea of secrecy has infected the Chinese martial arts like a virus. It seems that everything that emerges out of this cultural environment continues to have issues with secrecy. Even in Wing Chun, Ben's own art, where Ip Man loudly and explicitly rejected the idea of secret techniques and closed-door teachings, there are still vigorous debates as to which of his students was his super-secret, closed-door disciple. The truth of this is that none of them were. Yet the idea of secrecy is so deeply embedded in the culture and in the mythology of the martial arts that it is hard to exercise it. After all, we all know that this is how the martial arts were originally taught, right? Well, not quite. It is true that the modern institution of the public commercial school is a fairly recent invention. To have public commercial schools, a few things need to be in place first. You need to have a monetized economy where people have jobs that afford them the free time and pay them a cash salary that they can pass along to their teachers. The creation of lots of inexpensive, easily available commercial real estate also helps this process along. The short of it all is, our current martial arts institutions are an outgrowth of modern capitalism. They are a natural extension of our social and economic world. However, early 19th century was not really a capitalist place according to our current understanding of the term. For the most part, the economy was not monetized. Except for a small group of very wealthy individuals, most people rarely had access to cash. The Qing government didn't even bother to consistently mint coins, as they accepted tax payments in raw 1-ounce silver nuggets or in Mexican silver dollars. While there may have been groups of people who wanted to learn the martial arts, there usually was not really an easy way to pay a martial arts teacher. That's where we begin to see that payment often happened in kind. A student would pay a teacher by inviting them to come live with you. The student would provide them rice, shoes, and even sometimes new clothes. While this is effective, this situation is not very economically efficient. It is hard for a martial arts teacher to monetize the value of his knowledge or his skill with in-kind payments. As a result, many of the best martial artists would simply work for the military or an escort company, which were some of the few places that you could actually earn a regular salary, or they would not teach at all. Teaching was sometimes just seen as a retirement job. The best teachers were usually supported by a single family. A father might hire a teacher who lived as part of the household to teach his sons. This might be seen as a means of preparing him to take the government's military exam. Obviously, this sort of instruction was private, but was it really secret? And the answer is no. It may have been a source of jealousy, and certain ideas were exclusively held, but the teaching itself was not secret. If you had enough money to support and house a full-time teacher, you too could know the martial secrets of the universe. This was a system characterized by inefficiency, but it was not driven by secrecy. After all, these teachers were looking for a way to support themselves. Too much secrecy would work against their very basic economic goals. Occasionally, other teachers were able to find a way around this dilemma. In theory, it would be possible for a group of students to support a teacher just as easily or even more easily than a single family could. In practice, this was usually a challenge, though, especially when it comes to dealing with impoverished peasants. While everyone would want to enjoy the benefits of the teaching, when it came time to pay their fair share, a lot of people would come up short. And this is the basic idea behind the free rider problems in economics. Investopedia defines the free rider problem as a market failure that occurs when people take advantage of being able to use a common resource or a collective good without paying for it, as is the case when citizens of a country utilize the public goods without paying their fair share in taxes. What you would see in these larger groups and some of the problems that would come up is that cooperation is rare in these large groups, mostly because individuals do not directly bear the cost of defection and the enforcement of paying your fair share is difficult. What you're going to see in northern China in the 18th and then starting to increase even more in the 19th century are traveling martial arts teachers. They would have a circuit and would go from one village festival to the next. And festivals would often correspond with the selling of crops, so there were these rare times where peasants had disposable income. These traveling martial arts instructors would set up an outdoor boxing ground. They would give demonstrations. They would sell medicine, and if they were better known, they could even recruit students and hold classes. This sort of rural instruction at outdoor boxing grounds is precisely how some of the most important styles in northern Chinese hand combat, such as Hung Kwang and Plum Blossom boxing, were spread. Mr. Eschrich, in his academic research book titled The Origins of the Boxer Uprising, has even written short biographies on a number of these martial arts instructors. In fact, it is in a setting just like this where the 8-year-old young Sun Lu Tang first encounters Master Wu teaching a large group of local peasants the finer points of Shaolin boxing. Wu's life history is very instructive. Like Sun, Wu grew up hard and traveled extensively. Given his location and era, Wu's claim to have studied at Shaolin is actually pretty plausible. Wu's martial repertoire, which included Hung Kwang, the 64 hands of free fighting, and the Virgin Boy Qigong, among other styles, would have fit right in at the Shaolin Temple. Also, what was interesting was the fact that Wu was a veteran of the terrible Taiping Rebellion. That was the largest and most destructive civil war in all of human history. After the end of that conflict, he made a living as a public performer, traveling from market to market. The apparent easiness with which Wu accepted Sun as a student is also worth further consideration. Sun Lutang had to petition for acceptance, but it is clear that he had nothing of value to offer his teacher. Master Wu, who was 70 years old at the time, made his living teaching the martial arts in a traditional setting, yet he was probably teaching all comers, even the penniless ones like Sun Lutang. Later down the road, a different model of martial arts instruction can be seen after Sun arrives in Baoding. This is where he is introduced to his twin mentors, Zhang and Li Kunyan. Li was a student of Xing Yi and became Sun Lutang's second hand combat teacher. This is curious, as it appears that Li did not teach a large number of people. And why is that, you ask? And the solution is because Li had a more effective means of monetizing his skill. He was the owner of a very successful armed escort service. This career path was probably not open to Wu for a variety of social reasons. In order to be allowed to operate in public spaces like in markets, armed escorts had to have the trust of local officials. Li was a known quantity, and his social network included scholars like Zhang. It was precisely these types of contacts with the social elites that allowed him to make a living. It probably was not necessary for him to teach in order to support himself. But sometimes individuals teach for other reasons, sometimes to propagate understandings. Recently, researcher and friend of Kung Fu Podcast has been to Chengdu, interviewing local martial arts masters. One of the interesting and sad things that emerged from these interviews is that with the current contraction of interest in martial arts, there are not enough good students to go around there. There are a lot of individuals with a lifetime of skills who wish to pass something on, but they just can't find anyone who is interested in learning there in Chengdu. It seems that teachers need students as much as students need teachers. And at its most basic level, what we're actually discussing is a profound human relationship. When you look at the amount of effort that Li invested in Sun Lutang, apparently only because the boy showed an interest in the martial material, it is easy to suspect that this is not the first generation with the deficit of students. Studying the martial arts was not a socially prestigious activity in the 19th century, especially not in the social circles that Li moved through while he was in Baoding. Like the old Chinese proverb states, finding the right student can be just as difficult as finding the right teacher. In fact, many of the accounts of late 19th century China that have been reviewed would seem to indicate that it was actually a buyer's market. Sun was eventually adopted by Li as his formal disciple. Lacking a father, it's also easy to suspect that this ceremony had a deep resonance for him that went well beyond their martial significance. It does not appear, however, that Sun was ever this closed-door student of Li's in the more esoteric sense of the word that is in common use today. This closed-door term has been invested with all sorts of exotic meanings in countless martial arts novels, radio programs, and of course in the movies. Its original meaning was actually much more mundane. Such a student lived full-time with the teacher, often taking care of household chores and helping to maintain the school, so that they could dedicate themselves fully to full-time martial arts study, and they were working behind the closed door. Living with your teacher gives one an opportunity to observe their practice and their martial philosophy in detail. Often those aspiring to a martial career of their own might live with their teacher, though this was not always the case. Sun appears to have continued to work for his uncle, who, unlike his first nasty old employer that we discussed a few times, his uncle was actually kind and he actually paid him. There is also no indication that Li purposely held back information from Sun because he had not become a formal disciple or a closed-door student. In fact, Li indicated very strongly that he had taught the young boy's son Lu Tang everything he knew, and even introduced him to his own teacher to continue his formal martial arts education. Which brings us to the next stage of our observation. In popular discussions, the institutions of traditional martial arts instruction are always viewed as primarily an engine of secrecy. Their great virtue in the eyes of the movie-going public seems to be the perennial exclusion of, air quote, outsiders. But when you look at Sun Lu Tang's life as we have outlined it so far, it is clear that this secrecy viewpoint doesn't really capture the true essence of how these institutions functioned in a real, not movie, social setting. Rather than purely being about exclusion, the traditional modes of education created a artificial hierarchy which was meant to entice people to join. These hierarchies gave individuals a chance to build social status that they may not otherwise have an opportunity to develop. That promise of social status was in turn a means of attracting students, just like Sun Lu Tang, who might otherwise have spent their time developing other talents. It was the myth of secrecy and exclusion that made the promise of inclusion and status so attractive. When looking at the late 19th century martial arts history, it is vital to understand this very powerful psychological dynamic, where the myth of secrecy and exclusion created the promise of inclusion and status. Well, at the same time, it is probably also better not to believe all the propaganda. It does not actually appear that many people were ever turned away from martial arts instruction for any reason other than a lack of money. And in some cases, just like Sun Lu Tang's, that could even be overlooked. We cannot confuse this veneer of exclusivity for real elitism. It seems that most martial arts teachers benefited from this myth of exclusion and secrecy, but could not actually afford to turn too many people away. Now we're going to transition into the next section, promoting the Chinese martial arts, from networks to public institutions. The traditional modes of instruction also became powerful networking systems. As you might expect, the dominant metaphor used to define and understand these networks was the traditional Chinese kinship system. This gives one an immediate frame of reference to understand one's social relationships with other practitioners of the same style of whom you may have never met before. These networks of social relationships were very important to the people that constructed them. Workers in Guangdong in the late 19th century used this kinship system to network and to find out about employment opportunities. We can also be sure that individuals in northern China did exactly the same sort of things. These networks also became an infrastructure that could facilitate the transfer of martial knowledge. They were a means by which one could branch out, travel, and get introductions to study with different teachers. Rather than being exclusively about secrecy, traditional martial structures actually provided students with access to a vast network of information and contacts. The average martial artist, intent on getting a job and making a living, probably did not do much to exploit these opportunities. Sun Lu Tang's life as a young adult is fascinating precisely because he did call on the full resources of his martial network. Not only did he exploit direct lineage relationships, for example, traveling to Beijing to study Xingyi with Gao Yunshin for 8 years, Sun drew on other types of friendships and alliances as well. From Go, he received a letter of introduction recommending him to Chung Ting Hao, who was an important Bakwa instructor. He subsequently studied Bakwa with Chung for another 3 years. In short, a detailed examination of Sun's studies can teach us much about the actual social structures of the 19th century martial arts communities. Sun's frequent travels makes it clear that he had a degree of flexibility in his life that not all martial artists of the period were so lucky to possess. But it is also clear that an overriding ethic of secrecy was not the only thing holding them back. Rather than seeing traditional martial arts kinship systems as an engine of exclusion, they are better viewed as a secure social network in what would be an otherwise very dangerous environment. The real purpose of these networks was to build social status and make open sharing of information possible. And this is a critical point, as social reformers after the Boxer Uprising would spend a lot of time criticizing the traditional martial arts community for its fratricidical and superstitious secrecy. There were very few protests from the traditional martial arts community over the demands for reform. They certainly realized the value of exchange and discussion, and they also saw their institutions as something that accomplished those goals. Given the quasi-feudal economy that existed as part of the 19th century, these traditional teaching structures might have been the most efficient institutions possible. However, the basis of Chinese economic life was being rapidly reformed. This made new types of cooperation, sharing, and networking possible. Ever the innovator, Sun would be at the forefront of these reforms. We need to go and look at the early 20th century and the swordsman novels, and then later the kung fu movies, to understand the emergence of our current ideas about traditional martial arts networks. These stories often revolved around deadly rivalries between schools and the theft of this ultra-secret text that revealed the true heart of kung fu. And ironically, apparently someone actually did steal a book from Sun Lu Tang. It was his daily diary taken by a live-in student. While you can be sure that there was a lot of interesting information about the day-to-day life of the master in that volume, it is doubtful that there was any real hidden wisdom. Instead, what the wayward student likely discovered was a painstaking record of how many hours his teacher had dedicated to practice and hard work. It is an interesting observation that Chinese martial students from the 1960s through the 1980s were often actually more conservative in their understanding of martial virtue than their teachers. The life experience of individuals such as Sun Lu Tang, T.T. Liang, or Ip Man were shaped by tremendously tragic events and, as well, vast military conflicts. Having seen quite a bit of real conflict in their lives, it is safe to assume that these individuals knew exactly what the martial arts were, and none of them were too attached to traditional institutions. Rather, their loyalty lay with the goals that these institutions were meant to accomplish. When times changed, they simply created new teaching structures. It seems that later generations of hand combat students, more concerned with identity formation than with survival, came to see traditionalism as a goal in itself. This is a very different attitude than what we will see exhibited in the lives of most of the early 20th century martial arts masters. While some of these individuals may have been socially conservative, as a group, they are better characterized by their pragmatism. And you can see this in the life of Sun Lu Tang. Even though he was trained on a traditional boxing ground in the 1870s, by the 1910s, he is running large, modern commercial schools with hundreds of students around his Hebei province. Apparently, he continued to accept students with the traditional rituals, but there can be no doubt that the institutions that these students were educated in were quite distinctly different from what Sun Lu Tang had grown up with just a generation before. Which brings us to reforming the Chinese martial arts to save the nation. When examining the middle and later period of Sun's life, we have got to note the development of a new sort of martial arts institution. The rituals and practices of a traditional lineage education were quickly being adopted by commercial public schools in the 1910s and 20s. This process of consolidation and evolution was made possible by their increased monetization of the economy. It was also driven by the growing emphasis on training better educated urban workers and professionals. These individuals had money, but they also had demanding day jobs. Classes had to be restructured so that information could be conveyed within a 1-hour class period. These classes also had to be offered either before or after the close of a working day, or sometimes during the lunch hour. What that means is that martial arts instruction had to be remade to fit around a typical industrial work schedule. So again, we're going to see this veneer of traditional exclusivity being placed around what is actually a quintessentially modern public institution. This veneer of secrecy was not always good for marketing either. In some situations, it was necessary to publicly demonstrate your dedication to the nation, your dedication to modernization, and your dedication to revolutionary goals. As a result, an entirely new set of non-lineage-based cooperative institutions began to emerge in the urban areas of China between about 1910 and 1928, when the spread of the Gaoshu movement finally collapsed this section of civil society. The hallmark of these groups was a call for national salvation through martial arts education. Typically, such groups combined the efforts of teachers from a number of different styles. They publicized the martial arts. They called for reform, which was usually by ending the twin perils of secrecy and superstition, and they also published lots of newspaper and magazine articles on how hand combat training was compatible with modern life. These groups that call for national salvation offered classes at often very reasonable rates to both the public and the local schools. Jingwu was the first of these groups to really explode on the national scene, but it was far from being alone in the field. It seems that every city of any size had at least a few of these modern martial arts federations. A classical example might be the Tianjin China Warrior Society based in Tianjin, which did a lot to popularize and spread Xingyi throughout Hebei and actually published a few of Sun Lutang's books. The network that formed around the Yi schools, later the Zhang Yi Association in Foshan, is another example of these groups. The Beijing Sports Lecture Hall, which Sun Lutang joined in 1915 or around 1916, was a similar type of institution. It taught multiple styles of Tai Chi and a few other martial arts to the local citizens of Beijing. Sun saw his involvement with the group as a way to save the Chinese martial arts, to also strengthen the people of the country, and to contribute to the welfare of the Chinese nation. These grandiose-sounding goals were very common. They are not all that different from what a member of the Jingwu Association or the Tianjin Chinese Warrior Society may have also claimed. But an interesting question to ask yourself: why is there this sudden interest in patriotic community building inside the Chinese martial arts community in the first place? Clearly, some of the later groups were formed as a response to the initial success of the Jingwu and other early pioneers. There was also a lot of activity in this area around 1910, well before most people in the Chinese martial arts community would have had any opportunity to hear about the Jingwu. There are three related issues that can account for this sudden burst of institution building and reformist zeal. To begin with, the Chinese martial arts were in genuine peril after the 1900 Boxer Uprising. Not only was civilian hand combat briefly suppressed by the state, but it became deeply unfashionable. This was something of an accomplishment, given that it had never been that popular in the first place. The Boxer Uprising was an embarrassment to the nation, and it led to renewed calls for modernization. This happened in the military realm in 1905, when the Qing dynasty abolished the military service exam. And that affected martial arts instructors, because training students to take that exam had been one of the main professional callings of the Chinese martial arts teachers throughout China. Many people trained in the martial arts, explicitly because they wanted a career in the military. That career path, with just a few exceptions, was closed to martial artists after 1905. The Chinese martial arts took 2 critical hits in a 5-year period. Lots of hand combat teachers found themselves unemployed at exactly the same time that their skills are being publicly ridiculed and blamed for the weak state of the nation. This is the environment that fueled the burst of social organization that took place all over the next decade. Social elites were paying more attention to physical culture as they looked at reforming the national education system and the military. But the traditional martial arts were being shut out. In order to save their martial arts and position in society, hand combat teachers began to organize in an attempt to prove their revolutionary credentials and to demonstrate the benefits of martial arts training to a modern state. And the Japanese system of Budo, just to the east of them, was a powerful argument that this could be done. This is arguably the main reason why these groups were so desperate to get government backing in the first place. Most martial artists had worked for the government, specifically the military, right up and until 1905. The Jingwu may have been somewhat unique in its steadfast dedication to civil society, and it's not much of a stretch to believe that these groups were actually more interested in renewed government patronage. And they were also pretty happy to be incorporated into the government-run Gaoshu network after 1928. The evolution of the Chinese martial arts in the 1910s and 20s was shaped in important ways by large, non-lineage-based public institutions. And that is why it is important to understand where they came from and how they functioned. So in conclusion, Ben writes, some individuals dedicated their entire lives to these institutions. It is clear that Sun Lutang did not. He taught at the Beijing Sports Lecture Hall and even offered classes on Chinese philosophy there in an attempt to attract more educated professional students. But it is also apparent that Sun accepted other official appointments and teaching responsibilities during his time. He also taught a huge number of students in his private lineage schools. Sun's elite networking and role as a leading public intellectual of the martial arts were both critical activities during the 1920s. Friends in high places could open many doors. For instance, the widespread adoption of martial arts training as part of the physical education curriculum throughout the nation was due in no small part to countless friendships cultivated between the local martial artists and provincial officials. The next thing is that as more educated people became interested in the martial arts, there was an increased demand for a new type of literature. While swordsmen's novels remained popular, students now wanted more practical information. This demand was driven by the vastly increased number of urban consumers who had the buying power and were now beginning to study the martial arts during this period. The efforts of Sun and others to change the social profile of the martial arts led directly to the explosion of the Republican-era martial arts manuals discussed by Kennedy and Gao. Contrary to their assertion, small mass-produced boxing manuals or chapbooks had existed in the late Qing period. It is the hope to discuss a translation of one of these sources in an upcoming episode. But there is no doubt that printed martial arts manuals became vastly more common as numbers of educated middle-class martial artists exploded. Sun Lutang's 5 books were some of the most important works on the martial arts published in this period. In fact, it is probably safe to assert that his lasting impact on the Chinese martial arts came through his publications. In lineage terms, he was never quite as successful as some of the other top martial artists of the period, who usually went by the last name of Yang, so he did not get quite the same respect in China that one might expect given his actual contribution. Yet and still, his ideas have lived on and are incredibly important. They have been disseminated through countless reprints of his books, which are now firmly in the public domain, and throughout the lectures and discussions of how many martial artists who may or may not remember to properly cite the original source material. Anytime you go to a Tai Chi class and you hear inscrutable conversations about what someone is doing to their Chi, they are usually unconsciously repeating something that Sun Lu Tang said almost 100 years ago. The current fashion of martial arts, Taoism, and Qigong-based health practices that many of us know and take for granted would not exist without Sun's books. Sun Lu Tang's career is remarkable because he was both part of the general movement to modernize the martial arts, making them accessible to educated individuals, but unlike most of his contemporaries, he could actually give those middle-class minds something to wrestle with. And that, more than anything else, explains his lasting influence on the Chinese martial arts. In the next and last episode of Sun Lu Tang's biography, we're going to take a real close look at the origins and the afterlife of Sun Lu Tang's key ideas. Why did he believe that the Chinese martial arts were intrinsically linked to Taoism? What exactly did he mean by the word internal? And in what ways are these ideas still shaping the martial arts today? Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode where we looked at Sun Lu Tang's martial arts career and life and at the crossroads of modernity. So many things were changing during this time period, and martial arts was going to have to evolve or it was going to be squashed out. And many of these changes associated with modernity, traditionalism, physical education, and developing ourselves were all being interplayed both in Japan and in China during this time period. It is an amazing time period to research and study, and to also give us some reflection about what we practice and why we go about practicing it. I hope that you, irregardless of the style or system that you practice, or for the reasons that you practice it, have a really good workout today. Get out there, do your best, and make every heartbeat and every breath in your practice today count. I'll be talking with you again soon.